Hi, and thank you. Can I share my presentation from my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me try that. And there's no, unlike Michael, I don't unfortunately have recorded sound. So can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'll go ahead and start that then. So first of all, I have to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I so wish I could be there with you in person, but it's great to be able to be here in the morning on East Coast time here in Pittsburgh. The work I'm presenting is from my book in progress, and it's in progress enough that I've actually changed the title since I sent that kind of old bio. So it's truly in progress, but I'm calling it Sound in the Struggle for the Ohio Country, 1740 to 1795. And it looks at the role of sonic interaction in the struggle over indigenous homelands in 18th century North America, focusing on this part of the world south of the Great Lakes and west of the Ohio River that I'm calling the Ohio Country. And as I said, I don't unfortunately have an amazing recording, but I did bring sound makers. I brought, if you can see them, 2 jaw harps that I'm learning to play. And I will be talking about those today. So there can be sound at the end if we have time and you want to. All right. In late October 1776, a Lenape councilwoman accepted a parcel of gifts from American commissioners who had invited her delegation to the council fire at Pittsburgh, where Seneca-Cayuga, Shawnee, Wyandot, and Mohegan diplomats had also gathered for negotiations. The items she received, which I show on the slide, were personal gifts rather than communal ones. Some applejack, which was a kind of brandy, a cup for drinking it, red body paint and a mirror, and 3 jaw harps of the brass or iron European make, ubiquitous in the southern Great Lakes fur trade. They were recorded in a daybook inventorying the distribution of imported trade goods that the Continental Congress had authorized for the use of Indian commissioners negotiating at Pittsburgh on the revolutionaries' behalf. It's not surprising to see jaw harps gifted in colonial diplomacy, but the accountant's mention of the councilwoman and her little girl is unusual, since colonial agents rarely paid much notice to Indigenous women or children in official records. This entry's identification of the giftees offers precious detail about who valued fur trade sound makers like these in the Ohio Country, and even hints at how they were used. While it's possible the councilwoman meant the jaw harps for herself, her daughter, and someone else, it's more likely that she gave them to her little girl and other children in the Lenape entourage. From sources I'll discuss in a moment, we know that Lenape and other Ohioan peoples often gifted jaw harps to their children, and children would have needed something to do during the long, high-stakes process of a multi-nation council, like the one taking place at Fort Pitt in fall 1776. Jaw harps, bells, and other sound-making materials had been gifted, traded, and retraded in Northeastern American contact settings since at least the 1500s. And archaeologists have shown that trade sound makers like these reach the Ohio River Valley via indigenous trade networks well before European people themselves. Today, I'll focus especially on the acquisition and adaptive use of sound makers like these by Lenape bands who migrated westward to this region in the first half of the 18th century, pressured by aggressive Dutch and British settlement in their homelands east of the Allegheny Mountains, and that's part of the Appalachian Range. But much of what I'll say also applies to neighboring Native groups in the multi-ethnic indigenous towns that dotted the Ohio Country's waterways for most of the 18th century. And you can see these towns a little easier on this map where I've put green arrows next to important locations I'll be talking about today. But all of the towns west of the Ohio River, which is you can sort of see, hopefully, is the major waterway wending southwest. All of that was native ground, and those were all native towns. As in other aspects of the fur trade, Ohio people's preferences shaped the kinds and quality of sound materials they acquired, and they used them in ways that indigenized them. In the fuller version of this work, I argue that this sonic indigenization was one world-making process by which Ohioan peoples forged generative connections with other peoples and places, including neighboring confederations and colonies on their own terms. Worlding or world-making may evoke Gayatri Spivak's critique of the worlding of the world of the native, that was a discursive tactic of European empires. But here I'm following Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird's reformulation of Spivak's worlding as sovereign practices of incorporating other peoples, including Europeans, into, quote, indigenous histories that span centuries and remain centered in land and relationships, unquote. My broader proposal is that Ohioan people's ways of acting in sound and song were, beyond their immediate purposes, also acts of world-making in colonial diaspora. Lenape peoples in particular had a long history of relocation, and historian Dawn Marsh has noted that their distinctive worldview, born of this experience, let them create their homeland, in her words, wherever they moved, partly by creating an unseen layer of usage, memory, and significance in their new lands. In their 18th century towns of Kittanning, Kaskaskees, Tuscarawas, and Gashocking, the resonance of trade instruments acquired and remade, I argue, became part of the soundscape of home. By the mid-18th century, Unami and Munsee-speaking Lenape bands, known collectively to Anglos as Delawares, had resettled in multi-ethnic towns along the Susquehanna and Allegheny, Ohio rivers, and later in towns farther west along the Muskingum River in present-day Ohio. Naturally, they brought their music-king technologies, practices, and philosophies with them in their migrations westward, including their long experience adapting foreign trade soundmakers to their needs. Munsee and Unami vocabularies themselves attest to this history. Linguist Ives Goddard argued that a 1960s Thames River Munsee word for jaw harp, tlomp, originated as a loan word from the Dutch ton, and similar words are documented in historical vocabularies. I've shown just one here on the bottom. In 1785, a Southern Unami speaker shared a very similar word with an American officer during treaty negotiations not far from Fort Pitt at Fort McIntosh. Colonial travelers and traders' records also indicate that Lenape bands in their eastern homelands were trading with Dutch merchants for jaw harps and other soundmakers by the early 17th century. This means that when the Lenape councilwoman accepted 3 jaw harps among other diplomatic gifts in 1776, her ancestors had been naming, playing, and probably retrading jaw harps farther inland for a very long time. During the 17th and 18th centuries, peoples across Eastern North America acquired tens of thousands of manufactured soundmakers that European merchants imported to Atlantic seaports like Philadelphia, Boston, or New York, and traders then transported overland and along inland waterways to backcountry stores. French and British traders kept stores at military outposts like Fort Duquesne, later renamed Fort Pitt at Pittsburgh. And in peacetime, groups of Indigenous men and women, and often children, would transport prepared furs, skins, and foodstuffs to the stores to fulfill their existing debts in the credit system and barter for new trade goods. Their purchases often included intended sound instruments, like those I've described: horse bells, Morris bells, hawk's bells, jaw harps of Dutch, English, or Irish make, and those were just the most common. I've shown many of these listed here in a 1759 account on the right. They often bought intended sound makers like these, but also items made for other purposes that artisans back home crafted into sound makers. These included different sizes and presumably sounds of thimbles, coins, brooches, and pieces of scrap metal that women pierced, reshaped, and or sewed onto clothing and moccasins, anklets, bracelets, etc. As archaeologists and ethnohistorians have shown, worn-out kettles were a favored source of scrap metal for tinkling cones, which remain an important medicinal sound material in contemporary Ojibwe-based jingle dress dances performed on the powwow circuit. And I know I'm whizzing through these slides. We can go back to them later if you like. In the 18th century, Ohio country, artists also bored holes in trade pipes to make whistles or flutes, enclosed lead shot or beads in gourd rattles, and stretched prepared skins across trade kettles and empty barrels or kegs to create drums. These and other instrument-making technologies centered on upcycling, in our words, imported materials and combining them with locally sourced materials, like gourds grown by the townswomen in their extensive agricultural fields. And these adaptive technologies persist in modern forms today. And here, I think in the interest of time, I'll move along, but I just wanted to share information that the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma generously share on their nation's website about contemporary Lenape social dances and instruments, including instruments that are being crafted from commercial and found materials, very much in the ways that I'm talking about a few centuries earlier. Viewed from the native ground, in Kathleen Duvall's terms, of the 18th century Ohio country, fur trade sound instruments and sound amenable goods were part of ordinary and apparently widespread indigenous technologies of instrument making. Whatever their geographic origin, fur trade thimbles, kettles, jaw harps, bells, and other sound makers arguably became indigenous instruments and acquired their significance through locally grounded acts of song and movement by which Ohioan peoples worlded their world. However, the indigenized technologies, performance uses, and efficacies of these sound makers are largely missing from colonial written archives, especially official records. If you read through just, mostly official British, French, Spanish records, you wouldn't get a sense of this at all, really. Individual settler writers like captives, soldiers, traders, missionaries did include some helpful descriptions. And so far I've been reading these against the granular detail of trading and gifting exchanges in financial records to begin to identify patterns in Ohio country people's acquisition and use of trade sound makers. And I'm happy to talk more about these sources and methods for working with them in the discussion if there's time. But for now, I'm just going to share, I think, one or maybe two, depending on the time, descriptive accounts that have been helpful in contextualizing these financial records. And then I'll return to the 1776 Fort Pitt negotiations in conclusion. So one account that I skipped over is highlighting the performance on jaw harps and flutes by warriors and hunters. Another account from the 1760s, and we're not there yet on the slides, hints at the use of trade instruments in Lenape funerals. And this was common among other Algonquian groups as well. The writings of a Moravian missionary, John Heckewelder, include a description of his participation in the mourning rites for an unnamed Lenape clan mother, married to the famed war leader Shingask. The clan mother passed away in summer 1762 at the town of Tuscaroras, west on the Muskingum River. And Heckewelder reported that the deceased woman was dressed in the highest style for her burial, right down to her moccasins, which were ornamented, he said, with elaborate figured quill work and edged with small round silver bells. Trade goods that she loved were buried with her to send them on the road with her spirit to the afterworld. And the local trader's store supplied goods that her widower Shingask distributed to all the participants, including jaw harps that he gifted to the young boys. Closer to the time of the 1776 Treaty Council at Fort Pitt, an account on the slide here, a young English trader, Nicholas Cresswell, described a social dance he participated in at what was by that time the main Lenape town of Coshocking, and this was in September 1775. His Mohawk companion, who gave her name as Nancy, helped the young trader dress for the dance appropriately and painted him. And sometime after the night's festivities, Nicholas took notes on the water drum that the musicians played, the gourd rattles carried by male dancers, and the various sound makers that the dancers wore. And I'll just read his description. Their music is an old keg with one head knocked out and covered with a skin and beat with sticks, which regulates their times. The men have strings of deer hooves tied around their ankles and knees, and gourds with shot or pebble stones in them in their hands, which they continually rattle. The women have morris bells or thimbles with holes in the bottom and strung upon a leather thong tied around their ankles, knees, and waists. Nancy herself would probably have dressed in a Mohawk fashion, and she would also have worn strings of bells and thimbles whose tinkling sound distinguished women's movements. She may also have adorned her costume with other sound makers according to her taste and her access to materials. Later that month, Nancy and Nicholas traveled east to Fort Pitt for the 1775 negotiations, which resulted in a peace treaty in which the assembled nations agreed to remain neutral in the fight between Britain and the revolutionary colonists, the Revolutionary War. However, the Ohio nations were soon caught up in the British and American struggle. And in 1776, the Continental Congress sent commissioners to Pittsburgh to persuade those clans and nations who agreed to meet them to resist British entreaties. These were the negotiations that the Lenape councilwoman attended. No treaty resulted in the fall of 1776. And the treaty that Lenape leaders did eventually sign at Fort Pitt in 1778 was a disaster, as the written version apparently didn't reflect the negotiated terms. Still, the commissioners' detailed accounting records from those failed 1776 negotiations contain useful information about exchange patterns and social uses for trade sound makers. And I'll conclude by returning to those now. So I'm going to do a little show and tell of documents here. Colonial diplomatic negotiations were slow, tenuous affairs. And through September and October of 1776, the American commissioners had to issue quite a lot of gifts to the Indigenous delegates to persuade them to stay during the long delays before all the parties assembled. These gifts of persuasion targeted prominent individuals and small groups. One receipt on the top of this slide from the Clements Library in Michigan shows the commissioners gave jaw harps to a group of Shawnee men as part of suits of diplomatic clothing that were expected gifts at colonial councils. And on the bottom, this illustrates that individuals also apparently requested and received jaw harps as personal gifts, like John Kilbuck, the teenage son of Captain John Kilbuck Jr., who was an important leader of the Lenape Turtle Clan. And one thing I like about this receipt on the bottom is you can see by looking at the receipt itself, unlike the more tidied up account books, that the addition of a jaw harp was an afterthought. And I think that gives an interesting texture to the more, excuse me, more impersonal accounts that you often read. Jaw harps were also given as prizes in a horse race that the commissioners held at the fort while negotiations were stalled, as the Lenape delegation attended their principal chief, Nitawadwe, as he lay dying in their camp. The Lenape delegates paused the council proceedings while they performed necessary funeral rites. And on October 31st, the commissioners crossed the Allegheny River to condole them on his death and bury him at the cemetery outside the fort. As part of the well-established condolence protocol, the commissioners gave the Lenapes 24 jaw harps and other goods, including black wampum and a black shroud to cover the body. This was the second death of a Lenape leader that delegates mourned with condolence rites in the fall of 1776, as they had earlier marked the loss of the Wolf Clan chief Custaloga. As was usual practice at multi-nation colonial negotiations, the council concluded with a large gift of bulk goods and a feast given by the host, and this collective gift included 30 horse bells, 22 dozen brass jaw harps, 10 gross of iron jaw harps, 440 pipes, 30 kettles, and dozens of other metal goods. The civil chiefs of each clan or town in attendance would have been responsible for distributing their portion of these goods to people back home. Based on documents I've shared today, we can assume that the jaw harps and the gift would have gone especially to children, hunters, and warriors, although they may also have been more widely enjoyed. Some might have been buried later with loved ones who passed away, including children, or retreated further west. Most of the goods, as items for household use, would have been controlled by the townswomen, who would have repurposed at least some of them as materials for regalia and sound instruments for dancing. In conclusion, for Ohioan diplomats who gathered repeatedly with other indigenous and colonial envoys in the second half of the 18th century, negotiating through their ceremonial singing, dancing, speech-making, and gift exchange was a way of trying to secure their lands, to access necessary trade goods and supplies, and to rebuild their communities. Foodstuffs and clothing were obviously primary concerns, especially in the shatter zone conditions of the 1780s and 90s, when American troops and settler militias destroyed town after town in the Ohio country, including Nitawadwe's town of Gashocking. In these circumstances, genocide, starvation, dispossession, soundmakers like bells, jaw harps, and so forth might seem insignificant, yet the evident demand for them, even among refugee communities at Niagara and Detroit, suggest otherwise. These small goods had social and sacred purposes that gave them a value far beyond their monetary valuation in the trans-Allegheny and transatlantic trades. By the end of the 18th century, they had long been indigenized and integrated into the larger native world of the Ohio. World making in these conditions names interactions by which indigenous peoples have forged generative connections with other peoples and places in ways that Judith Madeira writes are not necessarily, quote, driven by any absolute sense of space or of scale, unquote, as in the imperial, national, and racial capitalist geographies that so powerfully organized the early Atlantic world. Embodied praxis and knowledges, including musicking, may have been ground zero for imperial worlding in Spivak's sense, but they've also arguably been the most unruly sites of resistance and resurgence. Sound artistry, dance, and sonic materialities and philosophies have long fostered people's unruly world-making in colonial contexts, letting them connect their here and now to other geographies, temporalities, and ontologies, including mythic or other than human ones. Lenape, Shawnee, Seneca-Cayuga, and other Ohioan peoples cultivated world-making practices in just this sense. Their leaders selectively integrated their peoples into the transatlantic political economy, but they also fostered older and new regional alliances and trade networks that sustained them in successive waves of diasporic relocation and, in the 19th century, federal removal. Listening to jaw harps, bells, or jingles as agents of Indigenous world-making can, I hope, further our understanding of the role of sound in the 18th century struggles over Ohio people's lands and how they survived them. Thank you.
Questions? I mean, I have one, if no one else has one yet,
Please.
but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more when you talked about the 1775 social dance and the way that certain kinds of sound makers were thought of as appropriate for women versus other people. Could you talk a little bit about like how that got decided and like if there were particular dances and particular kinds of timbres or sound makers that were associated with that, with particular gestures, or if you could just say more about that, I'd be super interested.
Thank you for the question. The information that I have on that is from a few studies of gender in Lenape communities, both in Eastern homelands and in the Ohio country. And so that has helped. Gunlog Fur has a book that's very useful on that. The one early written source is from Heckevelder, who does comment on the gendering. He doesn't use those words, of course, but the gendering of different timbres and sound technologies in Tuscarawas and other villages in that area. And what he says, which commentators have picked up on, is that women conventionally wore bells and anklets and tinkling cones in their everyday movements, as well as in more heightened situations like social dances or certainly in ceremony. And he distinguishes the sound of their tinkling and jangling and jingling with all of these different timbres from the timbres and sounds that men's accoutrements made. And in the dances, what's his name? Cresswell, the trader, mentions deer hoof anklets, which remained in use, I think, until pretty recently, apparently. So that's one source of information historically. I think, probably more recent information would be helpful as a supplement. I don't unfortunately know about choreographies. I wish I did. Yeah. But like I said, this is the beginning of this project. So
yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, Olivia. Thank you so much. I have a question. Can you tell us more about those mixed communities that you referenced on the shores of the Susquehanna River and other places? Yeah, that's it.
Sure. And this is very interesting and I think pretty well documented. By mixed, I mean mixed Native nations and clans. So towns, like Tuscarawas, for example, were clearly Lenape towns, but they included other Native groups as well. And often the towns were controlled by particular clans or fatries. And each ethnic group, whether it was different Lenape clans or you know, a Mohawk, Mohegan, and say Lenape Wolf people settling in the same area. Each group would have its own kind of distinct neighborhood in a way, or nearby settlements, but they were multi-ethnic, and part of that was because these were centers for trade. Part of it, which people were interested in, you know, a lot of people were interested in. One reason was because of dispossession, waves of refugees who were being pushed ever further westward by settler pressures and militia violence, would ask for land from other native groups. You know, for example, Wyandots might agree to host, and did agree to host, Lenape people coming west from the Susquehanna. And so there was this dynamic, as I understand it, of hosting other groups, sometimes of moving into a town that had originally been settled by another native group, but they were by definition multi-ethnic, and yet each group, I understand, kept its own neighborhoods. So, and this was the norm.
Other questions? I can't see, or do we have any questions on Zoom?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So I'm gonna suggest that so that we can have a break, that we take maybe 10 minutes and start instead of at 3:30, which is the time that the last panel is supposed to start, at 3:45. Does that sound okay? Sound good? Great, wonderful. As long as the presenters are on board, then we're good. Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Especially I'll see you in 15 minutes, 10 minutes at 3:45. Olivia, can I ask you a question between the two of us while you're here? Could you show the picture of the kettle drum again? It was really there was something really interesting about the way that it was constructed. It looked like it had these like posts in the side of it. Is that right? Yeah. What are these like little knobby things?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously they're securing the drum head.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I know, you know, what it says here is it's made from a number 6 cast iron kettle.
Yep.
But I don't know beyond that. There's a lot I don't know about this.
It strikes me, I think I showed it, I don't know if you caught it in the presentation, and I don't want to sort of dig around to find my PowerPoint again, but there is a particular construction of drums from in West Africa that uses that type of sort of post, which is like runs through the drum shell and has sort of ropes tied around it, and that's how the drum head is fixed onto the drum. There's actually, I was hoping the section was closed in the British Museum, but there's one that was apparently acquired, quote unquote, in Virginia, although made in West Africa, that is that type of construction. So I wonder if there might be some other interesting element to sort of trace down there or not.
It could well be. It sounds like you're suggesting there might be diasporic African influences there.
Potentially, at least in the technology, if not necessarily in what was being played, at least in the technology of making the instrument.
It's entirely possible. And it's purely speculative to say that, obviously, on my part, but Black African and, you know, African American, you know, freedom seekers and free people were absolutely part of these towns.
Yeah.
So when I say they were multi-ethnic, they were not just Native, and I should have mentioned that, and I didn't. It's something I haven't yet figured out how to address that, but it's entirely possible that
Just
there was.
really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Cool.
All
All right.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
All right.